Well, continuing our introduction to biblical archaeology, I'll mention a little bit about ancient writing. A lot of the more important texts are written on clay tablets in a script that's called cuneiform, little wedgie type things in which you would take a soft clay, write on it with a stylus. Well, anyway, the Sumerian language, which is the oldest known written language, is written on cuneiform, in cuneiform script. So is Akkadian, which has Babylonian and Assyrian dialects, as well as the Hittites, who lived in what is now Turkey, and the Hurrians, and the Elamites and the Amorites all have certain writings that are in cuneiform. The Egyptians had their own writing system, Egyptian hieroglyph, non-Semitic language. It's the second oldest known written language, dating to around 300 BC. The Rosetta Stone, discovered by Chameleon in 1822, was the key to deciphering it. It was a trilingual inscription in both Egyptian hieroglyph, but also in Greek, and that allowed them to decipher that, and certain information comes from there. And other writings come to adopt more of an alphabetic script, and so you have Sinaitic inscriptions that have developed an alphabet with the cuneiform. I should go back and say cuneiform writing has like 600 signs, so it's a monumental task to learn all the different signs, not to mention the fact that they change over time, so that the shape in one time period is different than a shape in another time period, and the shape in one region of the world is different than a shape in another region. But they simplified writing by coming up with an alphabetic script where they'd write the consonants and, for the most part, not have vowels. You get Sinaitic inscriptions of that sort. You get Ugaritic inscriptions of that sort. Phoenician writing is of that sort. Hebrew and Moabite and Ammonite are written that way, as well as Aramaic. And then Greek and Latin are also alphabetic scripts. Greek actually borrowed their alphabet from the Semites, so that the first letter of the Greek alphabet is Alpha, but it was borrowed from the Hebrew letter Aleph, or the Hebrew Semitic letter Aleph, and Arabic is also alphabetic script. Well, let me move on to just talk about some of the interesting things that have been discovered in biblical archaeology that has some relationship to the Old Testament. You have the Sumerian king list, written about 2100 BC in Sumerian. Counts of kings that lived before and kings that lived after a great flood. And it looks like this may be describing something similar to Noah's flood. Interestingly enough, they have very long lifespans, according to the Sumerian king list. Just like in Genesis 5, they have very long lifespans. Enme-Baragisi of Kish lived for 900 years, it says, though he was real enough to have left behind a historical inscription that has been discovered. You have the Atrahasis epic, and relates to the flood story, written in the 1700s BC in the Akkadian language. Shows the story how the god Enki saved Atrahasis from the flood that had been sent by the god Enlil, Lord Wind, to destroy mankind, because mankind was just so noisy. And it reminds you of Noah's flood, how God was going to destroy mankind because of sin. But Enki told him to build a boat to save his life. And the story's just getting interesting when the text breaks off, but very similar to the Noah and the flood story. Gilgamesh epic seems to continue that story. Copies of the text that we have are in the 600s, so the original is probably 4 or 5 centuries earlier than that, the story. It tells the story of Gilgamesh's search for immortality. He meets a man by the name of Utnapishtim, whom the gods have granted immortality after he survived the flood. And anyway, he's also called Atrahasis, so it seems to be a similar story. And again, these Mesopotamian stories are compared to the biblical account of the flood. You have archaeological structures like the ziggurat, which is often compared with the Tower of Babel. This is a reconstruction of what the ziggurat at Ur, of which we still have archaeological remains, would have originally looked like. We talked about how archaeology can tell us what, say, patriarchs look like. At least this is what Semitic tribesmen in around the time of the patriarchs would have looked like, and presumably so would have Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Here you have some stelas with hands raised to the moon god found at Hatzor. And it tells us one about their worship of the moon at Hatzor. But it reminds us of Genesis 35:14, where they had a pillar of stone raised as a testimony of God's revelation. Well, this kind of stela would be at least similar to the kind of stela that Abraham built, though it would be dedicated to the true God rather than to the moon god. We talked about the discovery of Ramses' corpse, who may be the pharaoh of the Exodus. In any case, he's a person who the city of Ramses in Exodus 1:11 is named after. He was Ramses the Great, who was a great builder. And Thutmose III may be the pharaoh of the Exodus. We've already talked about that. If you take the early date of the Exodus. We can use archaeology to kind of see how they made the kind of bricks that the Bible talks about in Exodus, the early chapters. We have the Maranethpatah inscription that first mentions Israel, that dates to around 1207 BC. Relates to how late the Exodus could be. It has to be before that because they're already in the land by 1207. It says in that text, Israel is desolate, his seed is no more, though Israel seems to have survived. You can do some archaeology around the probable site of Mount Sinai, Jebel Musa. We talked about laws of Hammurabi, which parallel biblical laws in many ways. Though they seem to differ in ideology, you could be executed for theft in Mesopotamian law if you couldn't pay the heavy restitution, whereas the Bible never makes simple theft a capital offense, showing that they have a different valuing of human life than Mesopotamia had. This is Hammurabi standing before the god Shamash. Again, you can see he's a god by the little hat that he wears with his god hat on. We talked about the stone altar at Beersheba, and there's what altars look like, or could look like, with their horns of the altar. We have inscriptions that tell us about the various gods, and so this looks like it's probably an image of the god El, head of the pantheon according to Canaanite mythology, father of the other gods, father of Baal, for example. El itself is just a common Semitic word for God. But anyway, some who worship El in Genesis may well have worshipped this god. You have Baal, and this seems to be an image of Baal, which is the title actually means Lord in Hebrew, but it's a title for the Semitic storm god Hadad, as in the name of certain Syrian kings like Ben-Hadad, and Hadad-Eitzer has that divine name Hadad in it. But anyway, the title of Hadad was Baal, and in Canaan they mostly just called him by that title. Baal was a nature deity who was supposed to give fertility to the land. And you also have the goddess Ashtoreth, mother goddess of fertility, consort of Baal in the mythology. We know what Philistines looked like because they tried to invade Egypt around 1200 BC during the reign of Ramses III. They were defeated, and a bunch of them were captured, and they were portrayed on wall inscriptions, as you see here. They have a funny-looking hat as part of their uniform. We find at 3 sites, Megiddo, Hatzor, and Gezer, monumental city gates that are all similarly designed, and they may well relate to the renovation of those cities by Solomon. Here's a cautionary tale. Here's a artifact that was showed up on the antiquities market, which is always a dangerous thing. And it was once thought to be a part of Solomon's temple. It has an inscription belonging to the temple of the Lord, holy to the priests. It's now believed it's a genuine Bronze Age artifact, but that the inscription was actually forged and therefore is not authentic. Pharaoh Shishak invaded Palestine, and it turns out that we have an inscription of his found at, 2 inscriptions. One, this inscription here, which is at the Karnak Temple in Amun at Thebes, Egypt. Fragmentary wall text lists 166 cities in Palestine that Shishak invaded in the year 925, which, by the way, goes along with the fact that Shishak is said to have invaded Egypt, according to the Bible, shortly after the division of the monarchy into northern and southern kingdoms. But he also left a victory stela at Megiddo, which has been discovered by archaeologists. We have the Tel Dan inscription. This inscription is written in Aramaic script. It was discovered in Tel Dan, which is in the northern part of Israel. And it was probably one left by Ben-Hadad, who in the 8th century cooperated with Judah to invade Israel. And it's also an important inscription because it's the earliest mention to David. It refers to the house of David in that inscription. So it'd be about 100 years after David, but nonetheless happens to refer to his dynasty. We have the Moabite stone, or what's called the Mesha inscription. It's the victory stela by Mesha, king of Moab, celebrating his independence from Israel. And Mesha refers specifically to Omri as the king of Israel who had subdued Moab. And this all relates to 2 Kings 3, where Israel tried to force Mesha to resubmit to the power of the Israelite king under Jehoram, though that didn't work out. The archaeology of the city of Samaria. Samaria was founded by King Omri, and at its lowest levels, when Omri would have founded it, there's all kinds of ivory fragments and ivory inlays for wooden panels and wooden boxes and the like. And these are kind of luxury items, and it shows the economic clout of Omri at the time of the founding of Samaria. We have the black obelisk that refers to Jehu, who in 841 BC seized the throne of Israel, but was forced to submit to Shalmaneser. This is either Jehu or his emissary paying tribute to the king. That's what the black obelisk looks like. It's in the British Museum today. It also mentions that Shalmaneser III had a battle with Ahab, king of Israel, at Karkar. Well, we'll continue this with the next video.